Hey y'all, Brown's back, and this time we're going to be learning about ovaries. In this video, we're not going to be learning so much about the general histology of the ovaries, although that's very good. Mostly what we need to know here is that the ovary, which you can see here on the left, is divided largely into a cortex and a medulla, like many spherical organs are. And the germinal epithelium is out here in the cortex. And then the medulla is a highly vascularized loose connective tissue that's the primary trophic center. That's about all we're going to say about the general histology of the ovary. What we're really going to focus on is the development of the ovarian follicles. Females are born with between 700,000 and 2 million egg cells, and those egg cells are all surrounded by a layer of epithelium, and together the egg cell and the epithelium make up a follicle. By the time a girl reaches menarche, or the onset of puberty, her ovaries contain combined about 300,000 what we call primordial follicles. And these things have been frozen in this state with an oocyte or egg cell. So let's just draw that. So we've got an oocyte here. So there's the egg cell. Here's its nucleus. There, put some chromatin in there for good measure. And in a primordial follicle, that is these kind of frozen follicles in stasis almost, they're going to be surrounded by a single layer of squamous epithelial cells, or squamous, however you prefer to say it. I learned squamous, that's how I say it. So we've got this simple squamous epithelium. There's our nuclei like so. Probably be more than 4, but that's how many I managed to fit given the size that I drew it. So a primordial follicle is going to have an egg cell or oocyte, C-Y-T-E, and it's going to be surrounded by a simple squamous epithelium. And if you're wondering why I'm drawing on the left, it's because I have photos to show you. So for each of these follicle types, I'll draw a sketch of it first to kind of help orient you to what you're going to see, and then we'll see the real deal in micrographs. Over here is a primordial follicle. You can see the oocyte or egg cell here, and it's surrounded by the simple squamous epithelial cell nuclei, and you can recognize them as squamous because the nuclei are kind of dashes, right? They're compressed. Okay, so these are, out here, primordial follicles, and the primordial follicles, you can see, live in little clusters way out in the cortex of the ovary. So this is the border of the ovary here, and these are called egg nests. Now, when a little girl child, a little girl infant is born, as I said, she's got between 700,000 and 2 million of these, and over the course of her early years, some of these are going to degrade in a process known as atresia, so that by the time menarche, or the onset of puberty, occurs, she'll have about 300,000 of these. And then every time, once her monthly cycle becomes established, once a month on average, obviously these things vary from woman to woman, but on average about once a month, follicle stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland will cause several dozen of these across both ovaries to begin developing, and the first stage of this is they become a primary follicle. So the big transition from primordial to primary that's noticeable to a histologist is a change in the epithelium. So we have our same egg cell here. There's a nucleus going on, but instead of a squamous epithelium around a primary follicle, what you're going to find is a cuboidal epithelium. Now, all primary follicles start off with a single layer, so a kind of a simple squamous epithelium, like so. Sorry, I said squamous, I meant cuboidal. The squamous epithelium becomes cuboidal. So this layer of squamous epithelial cells that was surrounding the oocyte is going to, oh, this is going to be fun. My pen thinks I'm trying to advance the slide when I tap. But what I'm really doing is trying to draw nuclei in these cells. Isn't this fun? Yay, technology. Okay, so roughly, there we go, and okay, I just need to press more gently. So when we have a single layer of cuboid epithelial cells, this is called a unilaminar primary follicle, meaning that it has a single layer of cuboidal epithelial cells. Now, once this morphological development changes from squamous cells to cuboidal cells, those cells will continue to proliferate, they'll divide, and we'll end up with what's known as a multilaminar primary follicle. So I'm not going to be quite as careful as drawing the layers here, but we'll have one layer of cuboidal epithelial cells surrounded by another layer of cuboidal epithelial cells and yet another layer of cuboidal epithelial cells, so that this follicle is now multilaminar. I should also tell you the name of these epithelial cells. So I'm just going to draw a few more cell membranes in here. Let's get stuff good. Okay, so this is a multilaminar primary follicle, and these cells are called granulosa cells. This layer of granulosa cells, or granulosa layer, is actually where estrogens come from. Now, this isn't actually where the root hormones are produced. I will talk more about that kind of towards the end when we see kind of a mature follicle. But this is so fascinating. Remember that before we began this process of becoming a unilaminar primary and then a multilaminar primary, our primordial follicles were just that. They were primordial. They were non-functional. So when this occurs, when we go from primordial to primary follicle, a new endocrine gland is being created. This granulosa layer of the developing ovarian follicle and a concomitant layer that's around it that we'll talk about in a minute are brand new endocrine tissue that didn't exist before, and now they do. So this woman before was not making any estrogen, and now she is. And it's the development of the follicles every menstrual cycle that causes the development of and maintenance of feminine secondary sexual characteristics. I think this is really fascinating. So let's look at a micrograph over here, and we can see both some unilaminar and multilaminar primary follicles. So right here, there's a unilaminar primary. Notice that the epithelium around the egg cell around the oocyte has gone from squamous to cuboidal. And then over here, we can see a multilaminar primary. We've got about 3 layers of granulosa cells surrounding the oocyte. And this will continue with proliferation of the granulosa cells until you get to these multilaminar primary follicles. Now this one is almost ready to transition from being a primary follicle to being a secondary follicle, because we're starting to see just the beginnings of the hint that some space might be opening up between these cells. In a primary follicle, the granulosa cells are always pressed right up against each other. In a secondary follicle, however, we start to see some gaps opening up. Okay, so if I draw, this is the whole follicle. Here is the oocyte. There's the nucleus of the oocyte. And what we're going to start to see, if these are the granulosa cells, is we're going to start to see some gaps open up between them. And these gaps are going to fill with fluid. Okay. So the gap is called an antrum. And the fluid inside is one of my favorite words in all of science, called liquor folliculi. And as this secondary follicle develops, those spaces will grow larger and larger, and will eventually end up with a situation where our egg cell is, kind of surrounded. There'll be this very large, conspicuous antrum all the way around, and then we'll have granulosa cells all over here. Okay. But even when the multiple antra, that would be the plural, merge into a single antrum, you can tell that this thing is still a secondary follicle, because the egg cell is still located in the center of the follicle. If you were to draw crosshairs through this follicle, you would see that the egg cell is still in the center. So here we see an early secondary follicle. So I'll outline the whole thing for you. Here's the egg cell, yeah, or oocyte. But here you can see these spaces opening up in between the granulosa cells. This that I'm outlining right now is an antrum. This is going to be filled with liquor folliculi. So this is a fairly early secondary follicle. If I erase my annotations and bring in a later secondary follicle, once again we have the antra are starting to merge together to form a single large antrum. So you can see here's our kind of main antrum here. And then over here we have some smaller antra that will eventually merge into this larger one. But notice that the wall of the follicle, or sorry, I can't say words today. The egg cell is largely central within the antrum. Now that we have an antral follicle, that is a follicle with an antrum, we can also start to see this layer out here, this thecal layer, T-H-E-C-A-L, thecal layer, and this is going to be working with the granulosa cells to produce those estrogens. And like I said, at the very end, we'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but you can finally see now this thecal layer that surrounds the granulosa layer and kind of encases the entire follicle. So finally, our secondary follicle will eventually end up as a tertiary or Graafian follicle. Graafian follicles, they're going to be large, and you can tell it's Graafian. Like my biggest indicator, the thing that I look for, is where is the egg cell located? Because in a mature follicle, one that's ready to ovulate, the oocyte is going to be pushed off near the edge. There's its nucleus there, and it's going to be surrounded by a layer of granulosa cells, and then there will also be a layer of granulosa cells wrapping completely around the follicle, like so. Okay. So here's our giant antrum, our large single antrum. Here's our granulosa layer out here, and around the egg cell itself is a layer of special granulosa cells called the corona radiata. Corona, as you know, probably is Latin for crown. And in addition to the corona radiata around the cell, we also have an area down here where the egg cell and the corona radiata are attached to the granulosa cell, but only just. So this layer of tissue right here, where the connection between the corona radiata cells and the rest of the granulosa cells are very tenuous, is called the cumulus oovarus. Kind of an eggy cloud, cumulus meaning cloud, oovarus meaning egg, and it is this connection that actually breaks during ovulation. If we look at a micrograph, and I'll have to erase my sketch this go around. But we're going to label these structures on this actual micrograph, so we don't need my sketch much anymore. So if we look, now this one is not slapped through the middle of this Graafian follicle. This is up towards the top, so we're starting to kind of see the top of the sphere, but it's still not bad. It's decent. So here's our egg cell. Here is the corona radiata surrounding the egg cell. So this area here is the cumulus oovarus. You can see our granulosa cells out here, so this is the granulosa layer, and then out here you can see that theca as well with our single large antrum. When it's time for ovulation, luteinizing hormone is going to be released from the posterior pituitary, or from the anterior pituitary gland, and it's going to travel down here, and it's actually going to rupture the wall of the follicle. And this antrum, which has been accumulating liquor folliculi for the last 2 weeks, is going to rupture, and the force of the rupturing will actually sever the cumulus oovarus connection to the granulosa cells of the corona radiata, and the egg cell and the corona radiata will be released from the surface of the ovary in the process of ovulation. Finally, the last thing we want to talk about is the theca folliculi. If you have, say, an antrum, we'll have an antral layer here, and then you're going to have your granulosa cells. So your granulosa layer here, and these are, nice cuboid epithelial cells hanging out, doing their thing. We're also going to have a theca folliculi. And the theca folliculi actually itself contains two layers, a theca interna and a theca externa, which the theca externa is actually going to connect to the rest of the cells of the ovarian cortex. But to make estrogens, what actually happens is the cells of the theca interna are steroid-producing cells, and they're going to produce the androgen, androstenedione, which will then be taken up by the granulosa cells and converted into things like estradiol. So the business of producing estrogen is happening out here on the edge of a follicle, and you can see it best in an antral follicle because there's that well-developed granulosa layer and the well-developed theca folliculi. So you know how we go from a primordial follicle to a primary follicle to a secondary follicle and finally to a tertian or Graafian follicle. So that's it for now. The video's starting to go long. Study hard. We'll see you later.